I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. Hello, folks, and welcome to another long-awaited new episode of Hellbent for Horror. I am super grateful for those of you who are out there listening and watching as the year 2020 just continues to pummel everybody, including Hellbent for Horror. We've been having a heck of a time. I'm grateful to be able to put out another show for you, and it has been one of those things where not only has it been a little bit tough to focus, but we've had the plague. We've had a little bit of cognitive dissonance from what's going on with the plague. I'm here in Northern California, so we've had heat waves and we had fires. There's been all sorts of things that have happened with best laid plans to have people on the show. They were not able to be on the show. All sorts of things have happened to kind of conspire to have a few months go by. I didn't want to have another month go where I didn't get anything out to you folks. So we're going to do a little bit of something different today. So I don't know how many of you have been following me on Facebook and the Women in Horror Film Festival stuff that I've been doing. But for those that don't know, I was having some serious writer's block early on. And what I would do is I would just get on Facebook and do a Facebook Live. I would talk to anybody and I'd say, I'm going to be on for as long as I can go. If you come on, we'll talk about horror. Whoever you are, come on. And I ended up getting involved with Vanessa Wright, who is one of the co-founders of the Women in Horror Film Festival. And for the last couple months, we've been doing a live show off of Facebook, combining the efforts of Hellbent for Horror and Women in Horror, and having guests and having people come on. It's been a real jazzy feel. It's been a lot of fun to do. It's a completely different thing than doing my show. So a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm trying to publicize horror and show the side that people love. But you know what? I think that there's something else that I've been noticing as we've been talking to a bunch of different people on the live show. And I want to kind of address that here today, which is that there's kind of a Venn diagram where things overlap. You know, there are people from different lifestyles, different backgrounds, different hobbies that in all other aspects of the world, we may not have any connection, but there's these small areas where everything does kind of connect. And it happens a lot in the world of genre. So there is this area where there is this overshooting of the circles where the Venn diagram collides. And so I wanted to talk about that because the idea of people not being horror fans yet still somehow enjoying horror, I think it's really an enjoyment of genre. Genre does cross different borders. So since I usually have horror fans or I usually have horror filmmakers come on, I thought today we'd have somebody who's kind of a captive audience and is not a horror fan. So today we have as our guest Lisa Gorski. Now, Lisa Gorski is not a horror fan, although she likes quote unquote some horror. She's a lifelong Star Trek and science fiction fan. That's the genre bleed. Her sole horror cred is hearing me talk about horror while she's been in the room for the past 36 years or so. So she knows a lot about movies and books that she's never seen or read. She's also seen pieces of a lot of movies that I talk about, enough to know if she's interested enough to watch the rest. Let's just say 9 out of 10 times, not interested enough to watch the rest. Along with loving science fiction, Lisa is a voracious reader of many different genres. Hence, our book collection, which is proudly displayed behind Lisa right now, is a mutual endeavor, and it is, to say the least, eclectic. It gets a lot of attention when somebody comes over. If you don't know already, Lisa is the producer of Hellbent for Horror. So when we talk about horror fans people not being horror fans hitting home, it can't hit more at home than it is here. Here we have one of the allegedly critically acclaimed horror shows that's on podcast, Hellbent for Horror, the 3-time nominated, Rondo nominated piece of work. And the producer doesn't like horror. So the producer of Hellbent for Horror is also my wife, Lisa Gorski. In real life, She has a doctorate in microbiology. She runs a research program in food safety. So, Lisa, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So I think we went into it a little bit there about not being a fan of horror. And I remember back in the day, I think it was 1984, 1985, I had seen A Nightmare on Elm Street. And at that point, we had a group of friends, and I think you were still in college. I drove all of you crazy wanting you to see Nightmare on Elm Street because I felt that this was a genre-changing film. I thought this was exactly the thing that we needed to get out of the rut of the slasher film. And so I remember basically forcing everybody, including you, to watch A Nightmare on Elm Street. And you were like, I don't want to watch this. I'm not a horror fan. And you did it anyway because you love me. And so you sat there, and I remember you kind of going into a fugue state. I think if I remember correctly, you kind of, you said you watched it, but you watched it like someone having surgery, like these movies where they have to like put whiskey on the wound and put a stick in your mouth and then, you know, set fire to the wound to cauterize. You were basically going through that experience with
it was
Nightmare
not
on Elm Street.
pleasant.
No, so I realized that after the fact that this was not a casual dislike of horror. This was a real dislike, and so I was like, oh man, I won't be putting her through that again. And I guess what we usually do when I'm talking to people is I ask what their first kiss is. And I guess for you, I would have to be, well, first kiss, but it's kind of a traumatic thing. I guess you can, let's still talk to it. What was your first kiss that told you, no motherfucking way am I watching these things?
It was 1975. There was a TV movie on ABC. I think it was called Satan's Triangle. And
Doug McClure.
Yeah, and Kim Novak. And it took place on a boat out in the Bermuda Triangle. And it turned out that there was a priest on board. And unbeknownst to us, the reveal toward the end of the movie is the priest is Satan. And
Satan, not just a demon. He's Satan.
He's Satan. And I remember when that reveal happened, kind of screaming, throwing a blanket over my head and mumbling to myself so I wouldn't hear the rest of the movie because I was so afraid. And said, not doing this again, never again. I should caveat by saying that I was raised Catholic, and so I have the fear of demons that was prevalent in the 70s and in Catholicism in the 70s too. So that didn't help any. And so it was many years before I saw anything that was even remotely scary again. It was crazy to me that anybody would on purpose watch something that would scare them. It's like, why would you go after that feeling? That was not a good feeling for me.
So after 36 years, have you gotten any kind of answer to that?
Not really. Well, there are horror movies that I really do like, but they hit on other nerves. What I've discovered is I don't like anything that's too violent, that's got too much blood. That just doesn't interest me. I guess I've come to terms enough with being raised Catholic now that I can handle the demonic stuff. I've seen The Exorcist. I love The Exorcist. I've even rewatched Satan's Triangle since then. It's so terrible.
You weren't alone, though. There were a lot of people that were scared because if I remember correctly, the reveal comes with this really demonic laugh.
Yes, like that was it. It was the laugh.
Yeah, so they're in a helicopter, if I remember correctly. They're on their way out. It seems like everything's okay. And the priest is in the back. And so we're up with the pilot and we just hear this, ha, 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 ha. And that laugh is what creeps everybody out. And the last shot, which is, you know, without giving everything away, the priest is in the water. Strangely enough, he's in the sea and we see a ship notices him and he's waving and he's just got this really interesting cat canary smile on his face. And that's the thing that they freeze at the end of the film to put the credits is this weird Doug McClure fucking smile. And I think it was Doug McClure. at that point. But yeah, it was really, really interesting. That movie scared me. A lot of the things that scared me as a kid are nostalgia pieces and nostalgia pieces only. The Night Stalker, the original Night Stalker, scared me to death. And watching it now, it's fucking hilarious. It's the biggest, funniest police procedural ever. And Darren McGavin's playing it for laughs. I mean, it's just, but when I was a kid, you couldn't tell me anything different. So we now know that you're not a horror fan, and yet you're still able to somehow circumnavigate this world where someone close to you is not just a fan. I think it's safe to say there's a bit of an obsession and a passion that goes along with this. But I think talking about passion is a great place to show where these Venn diagrams go, because I think, like many people who are genre fans, whatever their genre is, it comes with an obsessive passion. I've been watching a lot of documentaries recently about people with obsessive passions, a lot about pinball, a lot about arcade games, a lot about recreations of art, people going to locations, having to go to movie locations. All these things are obsessions. And I find that I watch these things obsessively because I do connect with the obsessive piece of genre. So you're a big science fiction fan. And before we get into anything specific, like what kind of science fiction, what is it that initially you're a girl, you're growing up in Pennsylvania, you're raised by a Catholic family in a working class area. What was it that suddenly science fiction was the piece that stuck to you?
I think it was Star Trek. I was seduced. I was seduced by Mr. Spock, and by the Force.
That's Star Wars.
Yes. Well, I'm one of the rare birds that loves both of them. So my family was working class, but it kind of had a science background. My mom was a nurse, and family started watching Star Trek. I mean, it was in syndication by then, but I would come home and watch it every day. And I just got sucked into that mindset of living in space. The first thing I could ever remember wanting to be when I grew up was an astronaut. And so I was just fascinated by space, fascinated by a life in space. And that was my gateway into science fiction. And through science fiction and my passion for science fiction, you would see some movies that had elements of horror into them. So I was accepting of horror in that aspect. And I guess that's how it kind of got underneath the door into me.
So with science fiction, you mentioned that space was a big thing for you, going into space. How old were you when we went to the moon?
4.
Okay, yeah. So I was younger. I remember enough.
I remember it. I remember it on TV.
And I think that's what I remember about the lunar landing. My parents were proud of it. You know, they were really excited by it. But I was way too young to know anything except that there's a TV and I'm watching this footage. And it was so big.
I was 4 years old when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, but I watched, and while I remember watching that on television, I didn't know at the time that it was the first time we were walking on the moon. I pieced that together later after seeing subsequent moon shots, because I watched all the rest of them. And then the Apollo missions ended, and then I watched the shuttles and dreamed about going to Mars. And yeah, it was a big deal. It was a huge deal. And I think growing up during that time, Star Trek gives you a feeling of hope and almost a utopia that you could achieve that, because we were surrounded by the space program when we were kids.
So you get this taste from Star Trek because it is somewhat mirroring what's happening in the real world. And so there's this great allegory of what's happening, or what we're hopefully will happen, that this in the very near future, we will better ourselves by going out to meet other people. And that's one form of science fiction. One of the things that I've heard of recently from another science fiction fan is that you don't see the Asimov style of science fiction anymore. In other words, you don't see hopeful science fiction. Science fiction isn't about utopia anymore, or science fiction isn't about the challenges of getting to that. Used to be where there were people who wrote, Bradbury wrote that way. You know, the Foundation trilogy would be something that I would talk about. These books that they're certainly talking about human foibles. They're talking about how hard it's going to be, but there was a striving towards. And now science fiction seems to be, there used to be two diversions. And I think Philip K. Dick has taken over at this point, where we basically have dystopia. Everything is dystopia. So what do you think about that?
There is a bit of truth in that. Lately I've been reading a lot more science fiction in the last couple of years. And I've been trying to read a lot of the newer authors. And I've been trying to avoid a lot of the dystopian stuff because I don't want to get in that mindset. I know you were trying to get, I tried to read The Road. That, you adored The Road, and I tried to get into it, but it was far too dark for me.
Cormac McCarthy's The Road.
Cormac McCarthy's The Road. I couldn't remember the author. Thank you.
Yeah, he's light reading no matter what you get.
But what I've found is a mixture of, with the newer authors, of not only there is some dystopian stuff, but you get to hear it from different voices. I really like Justin Cronin's The Passage, that was really good. With the
I
little
consider
girl
that horror.
Well, it is horror, but it's also science fiction. It's a mixture. The little girl is a vampire, but it is dystopian.
Well, it's a really interesting look as opposed to a zombie apocalypse, having a vampire apocalypse, basically.
Right, because I think it's a virus. I think it's a viral born.
If I remember correctly. There's also V-Wars, which I would suggest that you read the books. I think there's more than one. The books are really great. I met Jonathan Maberry, and I basically told him that. They just did a Netflix show, and I can't recommend the Netflix show only because I've read the books. Yeah. The books are this wonderful gumbo of allegory and metaphor, and really takes all of the stuff. And the show had to be pared down to where it's basically these two main characters, and that's not what V-Wars is. V-Wars is this wonderful look at culture and what we would do. And it really is relevant to a lot of things that we're going through in pandemic right now, which is, what about if there is like this racially tinged aspect to plague? It happens to be hitting more African Americans than it does anybody else. And there's kind of that thing that happens in V-Wars, which is the loup-garou, the French idea of a werewolf. Mm-hmm. And so there is a candidate that's I can't remember if he's a mayor, but I think it's in Brooklyn. I think he's like either the mayor of Brooklyn or he's a high-ranking official in Brooklyn, and he comes out and says that he's a loup-garou because it's going to come out. He doesn't want his detractors to say it. He thinks he can get above it. And so there are people who are supporting him. He can stop himself from doing this, and he's letting us know it's just a disease. And then there's other people who are going, are you fucking nuts? He's a loup-garou. He could just, at any point, he can just tear people apart. How do we know that he's not going to lose the ability to control it at some point? And so that's a real world thing. It's very interesting, where our best interests and our better selves say, well, geez, we need to, be freedom loving people, not wearing masks, maybe on one side. At another side, we're saying, well, you can't ostracize people because of their genetic makeup that's not fair. They're just sick. They're not pariahs. And we get into this weird area where we're not necessarily thinking pragmatically about what can happen. So I will recommend V Wars to you. I have the first book here in hard copy, which I think you might enjoy.
What I will say, a trend that I've been noticing in the science fiction books that I have been reading lately is almost a bend toward a look ahead into corporate culture. Mm. So kind of the idea like an Alien and the Alien trilogy, where the company is controlling everything. I'm reading a lot. I'm reading some more of that. I'm seeing it in some of the work from Annalee Newitz, who has a really good book called the title of it's escaping me, but it's our main character in that book is a patent raider who goes because the drug companies have taken over the world, and so they're making generic versions of drugs to deliver them to people who need them. And this is supposed to take place like 150 years in the future. Charlie Jane Anders doing City in the Middle of the Night. Becky Chambers is one that does have a corporate bend to it, along with some really fascinating character studies of people going into deep space. And in her universe, Earth is a minor player. And they talk about our warlike tendencies and how we got cowed by planets that were more warlike than even we were.
Well, it's very, very interesting that you're talking about the corporate side of things. It really feels like Robert Heinlein was right. I mean, if you look at Robert Heinlein's work, which is sometimes a hard read, he doesn't age very well. But Heinlein was always about the corporate world. Laws being taken over. Stranger in a Strange Land is all about a land war, really. Who is the precise owner of Mars? Who is this kid that was born because two scientists couldn't keep their hands off each other, and now he's the one who owns the planet? Yeah, I mean, Heinlein is an interesting bird, and I think it's something that we can talk to as well about horror as well as science fiction, but specifically science fiction, since we're on that subject right now. A lot of the old style science fiction writers were pretty conservative. They were conservative guys. And then you reach this vanguard moment where, weirdly enough, Bradbury was kind of a crossover guy who was less conservative. Asimov was progressive in some ways, conservative in others. It's also said about horror that it's very reactionary. But what do you think about where science fiction has gone? And when you were a kid, you were probably reading people who were pretty conservative. So how has that changed?
I think we're in a new golden age of science fiction, frankly. I think there are a lot of new authors out there who are finally getting press, finally getting seen. I think we're hearing new voices, and it's only good for the genre. I mean, speaking for myself, and we've talked about this before, but, I was a girl growing up as a science fiction and Star Trek fan, and there really weren't women who were role models for me. So I just decided, okay, well, I will be Mr. Spock. That will be my role model. And I will be a member. I used to fantasize about, or we used to play games where I was a member of Starfleet and I was the science officer. And I was human, but I was trying to strive toward a more logical sense of things, like Mr. Spock. When we go to Star Wars, I didn't want to be the Princess Leia and be captured. I wanted to be the Jedi Knights. And none of them were women. So in my head, I was going to be like, well, I will play act and be the first female Jedi Knight. That's just where I came at it. My thing was I never wanted to date the rock star. I wanted to be the rock star. And but what's happening now is I think we're getting a more diverse palette of different people that are the heroes in these things. And so maybe it's a lot more accessible to some people. Back in the 70s, science fiction might have been a real hard sell. I remember when the Star Trek convention started and everybody just kind of like waved their heads and said, oh, they're all nerds, they're all geeks. Well, now we've inherited the world and now we're making it in our image.
Yeah, make culpa. But yeah, it's interesting how much geekdom has changed. It's certainly become, I think, once they realized that geeks also make money, it seemed to change things. And there was just a change in popular culture. And I think that horror has also benefited from that, which is, even though horror is still kind of the redheaded stepchild, it's allowed at the table a little bit more, and it's not as weird as it used to be. You still have people who think that it's really fucking weird that you like horror movies, but horror has kind of been allowed in because I think culture has changed so much, as opposed to the pop culture is now ruling the roost. There was a time, even when Star Wars came out and Jaws came out and all that, there was still a very, very loud disdain for those kind of films. That there was such a huge difference between drama as real art and even Westerns as real art, everything as real art outside of these frivolities that were what science fiction and horror was. I remember Jaws, they could not talk about Jaws without talking about Melville. They couldn't, somehow they had to constantly compare it to Moby Dick. One of the great literary pieces ever, right? Only Moby Dick, right? Well, you know, it's no Moby Dick. No shit, it's no Moby Dick. What a stunner. And I, on the other hand, do feel that these movies can hold up to some compare and contrast. But there was just a disdain to that idea. It was only seen in a negative context. Any comparison was always going to end going in one direction. It was not in the favor of the horror movie or the science fiction film. But that all changes with Star Wars. It changes with The Exorcist to a certain degree. And it takes time. But I think it really is that the proliferation of pop culture where just about every movie that came out that made money, big bank, came from these mongrel genres.
Well, you haven't asked me yet, and I'm going to jump the gun here, what my favorite horror movie is. And it's John Carpenter's The Thing.
Ah, well, yeah.
Total science fiction movie.
Well, that's where it depends on preference, right? And
it depends on preference.
It's a Venn diagram moment. John Carpenter's The Thing. It used to be what was the anti-Venn. You couldn't find anybody who would say that was a great movie. In 1982, it was like horror fans hated it, science fiction fans hated it, critics hated it.
And honestly, I don't remember how old I was when I saw it for the first time. I definitely did not see it when it came out in theaters. I saw it later. And probably on video. But yeah, that's my favorite science fiction movie. I mean, it starts out in space.
Horror movie, you mean? That's not your favorite science fiction.
No, it's not my science fiction. It's favorite horror movie. Yeah, because it starts out in space, and so you've got this alien that's coming to Earth and terrorizing this lonely outpost. It's such a good movie on so many levels. And yeah, that's your Venn diagram. That's like the perfect science fiction / horror movie.
It's a great gateway drug. It's kind of like Star Wars is a great gateway drug for people who couldn't deal with Star Trek. And for a long time, Star Trek was a very distant second for me. I used to call it Dragnet in outer space. It was like this thing of just the facts, ma'am. And it was just so stoic. And it was wagon training. It was wagon training through space.
You can see that.
It just seemed very dry, whereas Star Wars was messy in a glorious way. And I guess that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you. You say you're one of the rare birds who likes both. There's such a huge difference between the two. What do you think what is it that connects so deeply with both of those things. One might be Spock in one, but what about Star Wars?
With Star Wars, the character that I most identified with in the first movie was Ben Kenobi. I wanted to be Ben Kenobi. And I think for me personally, I think that I identify with the sage in all of these sagas that come through. That's what I aspire to be. And so for Star Trek, it went that way, and for Star Wars, it went that way. If Star Wars did not have the Jedi aspect, I probably wouldn't like it so much. Just case in point, Solo, which has no Jedi aspects to it at all. I fell asleep through it. No, but the rest of the Star Wars movies, what the best parts of the Star Wars movies to me are the aspects where you can look inward and where anybody can make something magnificent of themselves.
So there's a heavy duty, there's a lot of people who can see that there's maybe more fantasy as elements to Star Wars than there is science fiction. But that's, once again, a Venn diagram. And that's, I think, one of its big appeals, is that it doesn't go down the path of like hard science fiction. We've had this conversation.
Right.
I've had this conversation on my podcast, which is the difference between hard science fiction and poetic science fiction. H.G. Wells is poetic science fiction. He barely tells you how a time machine works. And then Jules Verne, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, you could build the Nautilus from things.
I remember going to see Neil Gaiman do a signing in Menlo Park when we were still living on the other side of the peninsula. So that was mid-90s. And I guess that was Neverwhere. And so there was a bunch of science fiction fans in the group, and I was laughing to myself as I was listening to them ahead of time talking about different hard science fiction books and how such and such a spaceship would not work because the propulsion system just wasn't reasonable to do, or wouldn't work in faster than light travel, or how oxygen generation wouldn't work. And I mean, granted, this is Menlo Park, so we were right next to Stanford and NASA Ames. And so there were a lot of like really heavy duty physicists in the audience. But while I do enjoy some of the hard aspects, the hard science in science fiction, I was never one of those that demanded absolute truth to the science that was available. Now, I like it, and I like it if you try to mirror what's actually going on in science and work from science that we actually know. But it's not essential to me.
Okay, so since you're a scientist and you're a microbiologist, and you're talking about how, people talk about the propulsion issues and things like that and certain things, let's talk some egregious things that just took you out of movies. I remember going to see Splice with you.
Ugh.
And if anybody remembers Splice, it was a genetic gene therapy, basically, in a science lab. And they give birth to this horny beast. It's just this thing that's horny. So what was it that just, because I get people all the time saying, oh man, Splice is pretty good. And I just bite my tongue because I remember watching it with you and you're just moaning that the science was so bad.
Partly because the way they represented the scientist in there was so bad. I remember her giving a talk. Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever seen a scientist consistently working in a lab who wears stiletto heels. Let's just say that first.
Right.
But she was giving a talk in the beginning, and basically she'd been talking about her data, and had years and years of working on this project, and to little avail and no real positive results. And she had students asking her, well, why are you still doing it? And she's like, well, despite the negative data, I feel in my heart that we can really do this. And I just rolled my eyes at that because I just thought of myself banging my head against the lab bench trying to get something to work. And after so amount of time, you just got to say, this is not going to work anymore. We need to find a different way. Plus, nobody's going to fund you. And it's just the way I did not like that scientist character. I didn't like that they made her so flighty and so dreamy about trying to get this thing to work. And then when she finally does try to get the thing to work, she's got no scientific ethics. And it was just painful to watch. Just watching all of the stumbling blocks along the way where somebody would say, okay, that's it, we're done. And she just kept going and kept, no.
Well, I know that the Star Trek movies and the Star Wars movies, the new Star Trek and Star Wars movies, all have real nightmares to them. So I guess the reboot of Star Trek, which everybody absolutely loved, you loved it enough, but there was the Red Matter.
Red Matter.
Right? Yeah. So what the fuck with Red Matter?
Okay. So the new Star Trek films that were done by J.J. Abrams, I thought were really interesting for several reasons. Rebooting the franchise in that way so that you are not beholden to the original stories. You put them on another timeline, I thought was a brilliant idea. So you're in the universe, but you're not bound by the history of the characters. You can play with them a little. I thought that was great. Their MacGuffin, Red Matter. Oh, God. Okay, Red Matter, which was this thing that if you inject it into a planet's core, it will affect the gravity of the planet, or it will allow a sun to explode. And somehow you could carry... So just a tiny drop of this into a planet would cause it to implode, which is what it did to planet Vulcan. But Spock, and then later on, Eric Badu, who played the bad guy, had a huge ball of this on their ship. So, okay, so now we're talking about trying to deal with gravitational shear forces that are in the middle of this ship that you're just taking around the galaxy. Why aren't you dragging along every other asteroid and moon and comet along with you, drawn to this huge gravity well that you've got in this ship around you? It's just the gravitational effects anywhere that ship would just be insane. And that's where my mind was going when I was watching this movie. Whenever they would talk about this red matter, I would just be thinking of, but the gravitational well around that ship, how could you deal with everything else that would be attracted to you then? And it was enough that, it threw me out of I still like the movie, but that was a big pill to swallow.
It's mainly because Star Trek is known for its science fiction, right? It's science.
Yeah. I mean, and as Charlie Jane Anders says, and I agree with her, Star Trek always did have a little bit of hand wavium to it. But
describe hand wavium.
Where you kind of take liberties with the science in order to further the plot. And that happens with a lot of science fiction. It's just how much can you stretch it before the plot's no longer feasible. Some of the stuff in the original series of Star Trek is pretty bad. Next Generation was better. They had science advisors on Next Generation. The original Star Trek, they had a lot of classic science fiction authors write those episodes. So D.C. Fontana, Theodore Sturgeon, Harlan Ellison. So they were, if not grounded in science, they were firmly grounded in science fiction, and they knew the tropes. The new Star Trek movies don't have that. I don't know how grounded they are in actual science fact. I know the new Star Trek shows have some issues.
Right. The mushroom drive.
Mushroom drive. Star Trek Discovery, which I like despite the fact that I will never
every time they try to use that propulsion system, it just no. There is not a network of hyphae, of multicellular hyphae that is underlying the universe.
Okay, fair enough. I guess that's so. I laugh because you mentioned J.J. Abrams, and there's a lot of people who have issues with J.J. Abrams in many different ways, but it does seem like he's taken on the largest franchises, and he's just got these things that make people who are fans go crazy, including, it's like he really doesn't like sun. The sun, I mean, he's like the whole thing about suns being destroyed in Star Trek. And then there's like the weapon in The Force Awakens.
The weapon in The Force Awakens.
We just suck out of...
Let's drain a sun. We're going into the gravitational issues again. Let's drain the energy from a sun and bring that onto this planet, which, okay, we're also dealing with loss of gravitation from suns and gain of gravitation from the planet. And yeah, my mind just couldn't connect that. It left.
And it just seems so crazy to me, because it's like, you don't have to even mention it. Right? You just
no.
The original Death Star in Star Wars Episode 4. They didn't tell you how it got all this zoomy power. You didn't have to bring in, and we drain a fucking sun to be able.
Now,
to
Rogue One, they invent kyber crystals.
Yeah.
So kyber crystals are what give the Jedi lightsabers their power, and kyber crystals are what give the Death Star its oomph.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah. Invent a thing, right?
Dilithium crystals, kyber crystals, whatever it is.
Yeah. But he ended up having to, and it's so much just the need to have a timer. It's so video gamey. You had to put the sun in there because, we have to stop it before the sun drains, because that's when it's going to be able to shoot. So now there's a time limit. There's a timer. Now we have suspense. And it's like, God damn. I mean, in the original Star Wars, at least you had to get around a planet to shoot a planet. That was feasible enough, right? Okay, we have to wait till the other planet gets out of the way, and then we can go in. But this whole thing of draining suns and stuff just, drives me a little bit crazy. So you mentioned science and scientists and being taken out of movies because of how bad the scientists are done. You're someone who's had to live with this your whole life. You're someone who's in science, and there's been this thing since Mary Shelley of scientists being these people who suddenly just lose the ability to be normal human beings, and they become either God complex people, or they become insensitive in a way, or so obsessed that they're willing to destroy everything. How do you, what was good scientists in films? Can you think of any good scientists?
Contagion.
Okay.
I loved Contagion. And they actually had CDC doctors who were consultants on staff for that. They were really good.
Why do you think we have so much? It's kind of like one of the things that I don't know if I've said it on the program before, but I've mentioned in conversation, which is, it always drives me crazy that in the 1950s, you would see the aliens come, or the giant ants come, or the giant crickets, or whatever it was that was going to be big. And the scientists, there was always the idiot scientist, like in the original Howard Hawks movie, The Thing. No, we must research it. And then the thing beats him in the head, and then the military comes in. So it was always this thing where you had the scientist was always the one that was like the bad guy that allows Pandora's box to be ripped wide open. And it's the military guys, the army generals, and the plucky military, usually majors and stuff.
Because the scientist is so darn curious.
Yeah. and the generals and stuff, they kind of save the day, right? Most of those movies, the Martians and stuff, the good old USA puts a punch in the mouth to these things and they run off. And it's like, I've never understood that. And it all seems to happen right around the Manhattan Project, right? We do this thing where we set off an atom bomb. We create 2 atom bombs that we drop on civilians. That wasn't the scientists' idea, but the scientists are the fall guys.
Well,
so nobody seems to attack the generals. That basically said, here we go. There's there
was a group of scientists and Einstein himself who were afraid that Germany would get a nuclear bomb first. And so there was that fear. And it was the government who put the scientists together. But there are a lot of scientists who were more than willing and totally dedicated to doing that.
So you feel that the scientists are not getting a raw deal in that way, that they should be the ones held responsible for the creation of the big rocket?
Well, I think that's what Oppenheimer felt. In biographies I've read of Oppenheimer, he definitely felt the toll of the lives that were lost because of something that he was involved in building. Scientists who are, they're people. So they're going to have different feelings for that. It's just whether you can divorce yourself from the result of your work as opposed to why it was necessary in the first place. And at that time in history, there was a very real fear that if the U.S. didn't put the bomb together first, that Germany would. And then it would be used on the U.S. or
right.
England.
And of course, there are always the aspects of that are going to be compelling. I think it's how we can justify just about anything and still have the guilt. And I think we do have the guilt, and we've never gotten over the shadow of the mushroom clouds that it still follows our country and then the world. But I've always felt that we punish the person who allows us to do the thing that we ask them to do. In other words, it's like the generals, the politicians, like, we have a gap. The Germans are going to do this thing. And because they are demanding this, there are no, it's an either or, right? There are no and statements when it comes to this. Either we get it or they get it. Right. There is no compromise. There is no way around this. We don't need to drop the bomb, but we do, right? And so it interests me. It's like all these people with all the equipment, all the money, telling the scientists basically, suck all the energy out of the sun so we can shoot it out at some other place.
Yeah.
They're not doing it on their own. They're not rogue John Brown's body kind of people going, well, the government's not listening, so we're going to go and we're going to make a bomb. We're going to drop it. No, they were doing this in consort. They were requested. They were put together to do it. And it's like somehow everybody else gets away from the blame by pointing at the scientist. The scientist is the one that for the rest of humanity's time is the one that we question being too close to God. Well, what about the Icaruses that asked for the sun, asked for the wax wings to go up there? It bothers me a little bit that this is a spot that in science fiction and in horror, in our popular culture and in our normal life, there is a distrust of scientists over where, some of the ideas may come from. Being an old military guy, I know that most of the scientific discoveries that happen have military reasons for existing. A lot of the...
And no, there are scientists who are in it for ego purposes. It's a curiosity, but it feeds their ego to do it.
and not everybody in the world acts totally ethically. Now, that said, I think the majority try to, especially if you're doing work that could have real world impact. I think you don't intentionally do something that is going to get out and hurt people.
So let's lightning round this a little bit. You told us what your favorite horror movie is with The Thing. Let's talk about some of the horror movies that you've seen and ones that you can somewhat tolerate. Are there any? Are there many?
There are a lot, actually. And especially you finding some secret gems too. It's always good. So I tend to like the work of John Carpenter. So it's John Carpenter's The Thing. I love They Live.
Mm-hmm.
And after getting into vampire fiction, starting with Anne Rice back when I was in college, and then other stuff, I really enjoyed John Carpenter's vampires too, which is totally different from the book. I read the book later, but fabulous. But then there's a whole aspect of making deals with the Catholic Church in it that's just fascinating too. And the idea that the Catholic Church made vampires, a really interesting story. And I don't always remember the titles. So I think it's the one where the little boy is in a dream state. Is it
Little boy is in a dream state.
The little boy goes into a coma, and they call this.
You're talking about Insidious.
Yes, Insidious.
Okay.
I love Insidious.
See, I was like going, "Oh my God, did I show her Paper House?" I'm like, Patrick,
I don't remember that one.
No, you don't remember those. That's why my brain went there.
Insidious, I really like. Another one that came out later with Lily Taylor, where they have the house.
The Conjuring.
The Conjuring, yes.
Same people, yeah.
Same people. Did they have the same character in that? The older woman who came in who was...
No, I don't think she was in that one. It was the Ed and Lorraine Warren was The Conjuring.
Okay. What else? I really liked the Norwegian one that you watched a couple years ago that made one of your best of lists with the liminal monster in the woods.
Oh, yeah. I wanted to call it Ritual.
Really liked The Ritual. Really liked Green Room.
Yeah.
That certainly didn't hurt that it had Patrick Stewart in it. So there's a Star Trek connection. What else do I really like?
That's a place where horror has a Venn diagram with science fiction. The fandom. Once you jazz somebody, they're your fan forever. And you can be in any film and a certain degree of people are going to show. You can be Tony Todd. You can be Patrick Stewart. You can be the guy who played O'Brien. He shows up in a movie. People watch it. George Takei. I remember George Takei being in a bunch of really bad horror movies back in the 80s, and people would watch it because he was in it. So there is that whole thing with horror and science fiction, with a fandom itself. If you get someone involved, and then you excite them, you watch forever. Like for me, sometimes it was like Wes Craven was a hard pill sometimes because he was brilliant. He had 3 great films that kind of changed each decade that he was in, but he also did like Deadly Friend, which is so fucking horrible. And his Swamp Thing movies, he's not a comic book guy, you know. And there's some of his movies that are terrible.
Yeah, I didn't like Nightmare on Elm Street, because it was too bloody for me and probably too scary for me. So I just kind of avoided Wes Craven movies. However, I did see Serpent in the Rainbow because you were introducing it last year for the Alamo Drafthouse in Brooklyn. And I did enjoy that.
It's a great movie.
It's
highly
a great
underrated.
movie. It says a lot about colonialism too, which I found really interesting. So yeah, I would put that on the list now, where I wouldn't have put it on before.
So I'm going to say that you're a bigger horror fan than you know. As much as
I'm
you
sure
say you
I
don't
think-
like horror, I will say, let's talk about some of your favorite shows of all time. Buffy the Vampire Slayer,
Oh, love Buffy.
The X-Files, right?
Love the X-Files.
Supernatural. You watch Supernatural. I don't, on the other hand. I used to watch Supernatural, and I was like, Jesus Christ, will these guys ever fucking die?
It should have. Well, they've died multiple times. It should have ended years ago, but yeah, I still watch it.
So the thing is, even though energetically these were always mixtures, which I think is where horror has gone now. I think we're at the place where genre is about to lose those borders. I believe that the borders of these different lands are bleeding together because we are in such a place of hybrid vigor. And I think Buffy the Vampire Slayer is definitely horror, but it also is multiple other things. It lives on horror because it needs the metaphor of horror to be able to talk as exclusively as it does about being different, being a teenager, loss of family members, sexuality, all of these things that Buffy actually does so well. Probably wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for the big bad. The big bad makes that.
Oh yeah, but even beyond television and movies, literature in the last 20, 30 years is just burst with urban fantasy and paranormal fantasy. And even paranormal romance, where it's, Buffy, like, okay, we start with the idea vampires are real. Vampires and werewolves are real. Where do we go from there? Now we live in that world. And so is that horror? Is that science fiction? Yes, it's both. Mm-hmm. And there are some very prolific authors who are huge in those fields. And I've read some of them. Haven't liked all of them. But yeah, I've ventured into there. Patricia Briggs does the Mercy. I can't remember her last name. Who's our main character is a Native American shapeshifter. The Iron Druid series by Kevin Hearn, which we've both loved, is dabbles in mythology, and our main character is a druid who has a connection with nature.
Destroys mythologies. The thing that's
destroys
those books is that it takes all of these things and puts them on pedestals and then destroys those pedestals. I think that's why I love it. It's like he's almost like Inspector Clouseau with a Steinway. He's just like destroying. I think Thor is turned into, he's in a coma. No, Odin's in a coma. Thor is dead because he mistakenly kills him. And
Ragnarok is happening.
Yeah, Ragnarok is happening. All of this stuff. So he plays with the reverence that is in there. And I mean, I know people who are heathens, and there are the people who love that stuff and find ways to kind of make it into allegory. And then there's the people who go, no, Thor is making it rain right now. I love that Hearn, will poke and prod at that stuff. You have to know it to be as reverent, to be as irreverent as he is with it. He doesn't, it's not like Marvel Comics. Like, I mean, Stan Lee was not a heathen. his Thor is not,
The Harry Dresden books.
Right. Dresden Diaries, once again.
The Dresden Diaries, which was
even the name Dresden. Is hard.
Which was a TV show for one season on Sci-Fi, which was pretty good. But the books are massive, and I've got 2 on my Kindle. Well, I got 1 on my Kindle now that I haven't read yet. But yeah, I love those, and they're full of witches and demons and fairies and huge bads and scary stuff. So,
and even things like The Expanse. You're reading the Expanse books. I've not read the books. I've watched the show, and the show absolutely captivated me. It does everything that I want science fiction to do, and it's very much horror. the thing that I think is interesting where horror and science fiction intersect, it's like people will say, is Alien a horror movie or a science fiction film? Well, the original Alien is a horror movie as far as I'm concerned. It is a haunted house in space. And the way that the monster is, you are there to feel dread and fear and disgust and revulsion. The second movie is more of an action film. I would say the science fiction movie is 3. And then the ones after that, I'm not sure what you call it. Alien 3, which is one of the most hated, feels very science fiction-y to me because
Is that a Joss Whedon?
No, that
Joss
was
Whedon write that?
no, that was I don't know if Joss Whedon wrote it, but I know that it was directed by Fincher, David Fincher directed.
Okay.
And I mean, from the very beginning, even though that movie has a lot of horror in it, there's just an aspect of this penal colony, and everything about it feels very much like a comment that Piers Anthony might make. And so, I was.
Well, there's far less humor than Piers Anthony would have.
Well, yeah. But yeah, true. maybe Piers was not the best answer for that. But we'll go to the obvious. We'll just go with Dick. PK Dick. You can sit there and say there's a paranoia that's in that film. That's something big. But they're all horror films and they're all science fiction films because the big bad is respectfully looked at. And that's, I think, the difference between science fiction and horror when it really, like The Blob is horror. It's not science fiction. Yeah, there's a meteor that comes down to the earth, but it's very Lovecraftian in the way that it is a substance that defies physics and science. It is an eating thing, and it's just there to eat. So you can look at it as an allegorical look at the amoeba and phaging, but at the same point, it doesn't go into detail like, oh, this xenomorph has 3 stages to its digestion. So you have this thing of a 3-stage beast, and they go into detail on those 3 stages and how it's an egg form and there's this humidity that's kept inside of this lair and all those eggs, then it has to get into a host, and then it ingests inside of the host and it builds, and then it has acid for blood, and then it starts as this small thing, and then it morphs into this thing. So even though acid and blood doesn't make a lot of sense, there's a mechanics that feels very science fiction-y to the alien, whereas the Blob is, we're not going to explain anything. We don't have to explain anything. It came from fucking space, and it's here, and it's eating things. And to me, that's horror.
And may I be the first person to bring up on your podcast Lovecraft Country?
Oh yeah,
the new show on HBO, which is horror and is so far, after 3 episodes, fabulous.
Yeah. 2 episodes is all we've seen so far, and it's captivating. Yeah, it's amazing. It's great because it does what horror. Some may argue that it might be a little bit too on the nose. In other words, when we do allegory and stuff in horror, most of the time the reason that the best stuff is subtext, right? And the subtext has to stay sub. There's no subtext in the Lovecraft Country to the thing.
We'll see where it goes, because it did in episode 2 what we thought it was going to take all season to do.
Oh, I know. I have no idea where it's going to go.
So it's an open box from now.
But when you're talking about subtext in something like, say, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, it's the easiest answer, right? You can have 3 movies that are based on Invasion of the Body Snatchers in different decades. Each one still has the monster, but what the monster represents is never overtly in your face. You can read into it, and you can have people with different points of view read into these things and see something that specifically speaks to them. Whereas Lovecraft Country, basically, and what I love about it is that it's kind of punk rock in the way it goes. Now, we're going to talk about Lovecraft. We're going to talk about Lovecraft being a racist. We're going to talk about the country being as it is. The real horror is going to be real horror. But then there's also going to be monsters, right? So the real horror is sundown towns, which are real. And the idea of people being, Black people being used basically as experiments, right? The idea of what happens to Tuskegee and other various
Talk about
places.
unethical scientists.
Yeah, there are inferences of that in the second episode. And what I love about it is that it just goes right for you. It shows no subtlety. And without subtlety, it's not just burning tires. It's really about the people, the characters. The storyline is engaging, especially when it's a history lesson. You know, they're basically playing these amazing speeches and debates. The first one was a debate. Oh my goodness, yeah. I'm forgetting. It was the debate between William Buckley and I'm forgetting
Baldwin.
James Baldwin. Thank you.
James Baldwin.
Yeah, and so that is part of what makes that so interesting and inspiring, is that you are being hit with a lot of information that is very real, thrown into your science fiction and your horror, and it works incredibly well. Not my normal cup of tea in the way of like, I'm usually like, wow, like George Romero films. The first two Dead films, the Dawn and Night of the Living Dead, are subtext. You know, it's all about the subtext. And then by the last movies you're watching, and it's like George knows that he's known for his subtext. There's no subtext. Everything's
it's
right up front.
Banging you over the head with it.
Yeah, it's banging you over the head with stuff. And I don't think that Lovecraft Country is doing that, because it cleverly does put everything right in your face, but that's not the point of the story. We're not sure where this story is supposed to go yet. So we have all this information, but that's not what the story's about yet. And so it's been really intriguing to watch. My jaw dropped when you were watching it. You were like, holy shit, I didn't think there were going to be real monsters. I was like, I thought there were going to be fucking monsters from the very fucking beginning. Are you kidding me? You were like, no, I was like, I don't even know what to say. Lovecraft Country. I mean,
I didn't know about it before it came on, but I had read enough about it to know that they were dealing with Jim Crow and race relations in the 50s. And so my perception was that, and knowing that Lovecraft himself was a racist, my perception was that Lovecraft Country, the Lovecraft part, was a metaphor for all of the social context that was going on. I didn't think there would be actual... It is, but I didn't think there would be actual Lovecraftian monsters. And so when the first one appeared, it surprised me. I had a big jump response.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing show, and it even comments on itself. And you know, that's a choice and that's a taste. I can see where some people aren't going to be able to hang with it, because they're going to be going, man, it's so. Yeah, some people will say it's obvious or whatnot, or it is kind of fourth wall breaking. It's self-referential in a way. It has a I don't know if breaking fourth wall is the right way to say it, but I guess postmodern. I hate that word, but it has this thing of that it knows that Lovecraft books are there. It knows that it's talking about that. It knows what it is, to the point where there was a moment in there where I believe they talked about being seen. Being seen is the most important piece. When you haven't been seen before, even if it's a negative light, you're being seen, and that is legitimizing. And that's really, I think, where a lot of the appeal of Lovecraft Country is that this is an opportunity once again for a certain style of character that hasn't been seen for a while to be seen. A bookish, middle-aged black guy, right?
Right. And I love that about our main characters. They're all members of the same science fiction book club.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have all of that kind of stuff that's there, and people are being seen. It's not like this weird tokenism that tends to happen. Instead, this is a unapologetically, African-American experience through horror and science fiction that is also still accessible, as long as you're willing to go down that path. And I think for those that can't deal with it that well, I go, now you kind of get an idea what it was like since 1950 to not be able to see a black face in horror films because everybody was a scientist and there were no scientists who were black. So they didn't have anywhere to put the black characters. So they just didn't have them. And then when you finally did have them come back, they were always dying first, which is debatable whether that's absolute. But at the same point, it happens enough that we all, we certainly feel it. So people have to deal with that for decades, right? And just kind of paint between the lines to appreciate the stories and enjoy the stories, even though they weren't being seen. So being seen is a huge deal. And that's something that's talked about in that show. So it is somewhat referential to itself. It knows what it is. It knows what it's doing. And that's either an artistic choice that you're going to go with, or it's an artistic choice that you're going to go, well, that's red matter to me. And I can see some people having an issue with that, but I don't. I think
that's their loss, because so far it's a really good show.
It's so, I talk about it a lot. Sincere pumpkin patch. It's the most sincere pumpkin patch. The thing that I respond to a lot of times, even if the movie might be clumsy, even if the show is dated, whatever it might be, there are things that are in my lexicon that I absolutely love because of the sincerity of it. It is a sincere pumpkin patch. And what I feel here is that everybody is trying to do the best fucking work that they can. And they're not going, well, let's just roll with it. It feels very tight and very, and yet wonderfully almost off the rails. Like, I don't know where it's going to go. I'm not sure what its gumbo is. It starts in the trenches of World War. Well, it doesn't start in Korea, does it? I mean, it starts with somebody stabbing guys in trenches. So it starts in like
doesn't
the
he
20s.
have a World War I dream? But it turns out to be his dream,
right?
That he's superimposing a science fiction story.
He's looking at John Carter of Mars. He's remembering, and that's the other story where they're bringing in all these guys and that's something that I think is also very pointed, very interesting, and full of conversation that we can have about Lovecraft Country, which is that they keep bringing up artists, novelists who do great things that are still loved by the African-American community, because these were the great stories. He basically says John Carter is this great story that I can run from my life and enjoy. And yet, Edgar Rice Burroughs, not necessarily a right. I mean, you read Tarzan, you're going to have problems, right? It's a difficult thing. Yet, we can't deny that Tarzan's a great story, right? And it's remembered, and there's a reason that it's remembered. And so there are the very unfortunate things that you can't get rid of, and you shouldn't get rid of. You should talk to every time that it's brought up. Edgar Rice Burroughs, every time that Lovecraft is brought up, you should have to bring up his poorly named poem. All of those things, you don't deny it. There's no either or. It's an and statement. You watch, you keep these things, and you put them into social context, and you don't apologize for them. You let them be those things that they are. And I think that's what this show does as well. They love Lovecraft. You don't come up with Lovecraft Country and deal with these beasts and talk about this stuff and know the world that was created by Lovecraft and know the names of like the publishing companies and getting the book right. You don't do that if you hate it. This is beloved. And yet, because that's what you grew up with, that was your choices, or whatever it was. That was what you had. So you fall in love. And that's once again where we dovetail, where we have our Venn diagram, our passions as geeks, as science fiction, or as horror people. We find the thing that lessens the pain of our normal life and lets us escape and finds the best part of us that we can somehow emblazon on the stories. So we love the stories, even if they are problematic. And so I think that that's what's great about Lovecraft Country. I was like, I'm so loving that this show isn't pretending that we don't know that there's racist issues. It's all okay. We're not going to talk to it. I love that first episode. They go right at it.
Right.
And it doesn't, it's not just lingering there. It's part of the story. It's part of the reasoning. And it's the least nasty thing that's going to happen is stuff that's in the pages of Lovecraft.
Yeah.
And so I'm intrigued to see where it goes. So we've been going for quite a bit of time. Let's talk a little bit about science fiction and horror hybridization, and let's talk about things like recommendations. Is I guess is what I'm going to talk to movies that my fandom. In our group is obviously it skews more horror, but I do believe that most of the people who watch or listen also are science fiction fans to a certain degree, or may be interested to talk into some science fiction that's horror tinged after this conversation. So why don't you give a couple things that that you think are must reads or must watches for people?
Stuff that would be science fiction and horror.
Yeah, or things that you want to talk to that they should be reading in science fiction. Although I think if you can find the ones that are a little bit more horrific, that probably would play in. Like Justin Cronin's a great one, right?
Justin Cronin's a great one. N.K. Jemisin has a trilogy called the Broken Earth Trilogy. She's an amazing world builder, and and in this world, there are people who can control geology. They can cause earthquakes to happen, and everybody is terribly fearful of them. It's an amazing trilogy, and so I think people should check that out. The Broken Earth Trilogy by N.K. Jemisin won the Hugo Award. All three books won the Hugo Awards a few years ago. I'm going to look back at the shelf. Oh, these aren't horror. Mary Robinette Kowell has written the Lady Astronaut series. And the third book just came out, and I haven't read the third book yet, but the idea in this series is that it's an alternate history. So an extinction level event happens on Earth in the 1950s, where an asteroid hits on Earth, and they know that it's going to be extinction level, but it's going to take 10, 15 years for that to happen. So the space program gets put on big overdrive. And so our main characters are women who are the computers, the people who do the math for the space program. And it deals with going into space early. It deals with gender relations, sexual roles, men and women, as well as race relations, because we're in the 1950s. So that's the Lady Astronaut series by Mary Robinette Kowell, Kowal.
How about talking quick to the Expanse, because we mentioned it very briefly about it.
Yeah, we did. The Expanse. That's a whole series of books now, and I'm still working my way through them. That's James S.A. Corey, which is a nom de plume for two authors whose names escape me now, but they used to work for George R.R. Martin, which is really interesting because the books themselves have a Martin-esque feel to them. They're very much like a space opera type thing. And we switch our points of view in different characters, with different characters in different chapters. But The Expanse is hard science fiction, but it's really good. They've got some good characters and probably some of the best characters in science fiction. You can probably hear the dog right now.
we have a puppy invasion, and that's a great sign that we have run our course on this show. And Lisa, thank you so much for coming on. And I hope that the people who have been listening have heard a few nuggets around science fiction and horror.
So.
The wonderful blend that there is there, and how I do believe that we are finally getting to a place where most labels are starting to evaporate. Maybe it's always been an issue and we never even knew it, which is the difference between political parties, the difference between sexualities, the difference between musical tastes, the difference between culture, and the difference between even our entertainment. And maybe it's time for all those blurrings to happen, where maybe if we have enough of that stuff, we no longer care. And we just go to the story, to the person, to the results, to the pleasures, to the embetterment of our communities, and stop worrying about the minutiae that keeps putting those velvet ropes up. Maybe it's that time that we're in where we can find ourselves saying goodbye to genre, and then we'll find something else to get all pissed about. But until then, I want to thank everybody for listening. It's a pleasure getting to speak with all of you and getting to speak more about horror and all the things that go into the wonderful world of genre. And until next time, stay hellbent. And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.